At 2:43 a.m. Eastern Time on March 2, 2026, a red phone rang inside the White House Situation Room, and within minutes, a chain reaction began that most Americans would never hear about. The call didn't come from a foreign government or a military command. It came from NASA's Planetary Defense Coordination Office, and the subject line alone was enough to freeze the room. Comet C, 2019 Y4 Atlas. An object the world believed had vanished 5 years earlier was suddenly back at the center of national security discussions. By sunrise, senior officials from the National Security Council, the Department of Defense, and the intelligence community were rushing into a classified emergency briefing. By noon, congressional leadership had been quietly summoned, and by that evening, a carefully phrased public statement was released, vague enough to sound routine, but deliberate enough to hide what was really happening. Washington wasn't reacting to something new in space. It was reacting to something it had already missed. For years, Atlas was considered settled history. In early 2020, the comet dazzled astronomers as it brightened rapidly, then disappointed them just as quickly when it fragmented and disappeared near the Sunday. It became a footnote, an interesting but ultimately unremarkable casualty of solar heating. But something changed in early 2026. Officials suddenly treated Atlas not as an old scientific curiosity, but as an unresolved risk. The question driving those closed-door meetings wasn't what Atlas was doing now. It was what Atlas may have done then, while the world was too distracted to notice. Over the past 2 weeks, I've spoken with sources in Washington, reviewed leaked summaries, and reconstructed what was discussed in those classified sessions. What emerges is deeply unsettling. In 2020, amid lockdowns, overwhelmed hospitals, and global uncertainty, critical data about Atlas went unanalyzed. The government is now realizing that the comet's behavior may have been far more significant than anyone understood at the time. And the timing of its arrival may not have been random at all. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to March 2020. The pandemic was accelerating. Governments were scrambling. Scientific institutions were shutting down or operating with minimal staff. Conferences were canceled. Research teams were scattered. In that chaos, Atlas brightened unexpectedly as it approached the inner solar system. When it began breaking apart, astronomers noticed oddities in its fragmentation, details that under normal circumstances would have triggered immediate, intense investigation. But these were not normal circumstances. NASA and other agencies did collect data. The Hubble Space Telescope captured images of the comet's nucleus before it broke apart. Ground-based observatories tracked fragments as they drifted and vaporized. But the deeper analysis never happened. There was no coordinated global effort to examine the data in real time, no rapid peer review, no urgent modeling. The world had more immediate emergencies to manage. By the time Atlas fully disintegrated and faded from view, attention had moved on. The data didn't disappear. It was archived. Images were logged. Trajectory information was stored, waiting for future review. And for nearly 5 years, that's where Atlas remained, untouched and unquestioned, until January 2025. That's when Dr. Patricia Hammond, an orbital mechanics specialist at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, was assigned a routine project, updating risk models for objects entering the solar system from interstellar space. As part of her work, she chose Atlas as a historical case study. It was well documented, widely observed, and presumed to be understood. What she found instead made her stop immediately. As Dr. Hammond reviewed Atlas's trajectory data, she noticed subtle but consistent anomalies. The comet's path showed tiny adjustments as it moved toward the Sunday. At first glance, they were small enough to dismiss, but the pattern didn't fit known models. Comets can change course slightly due to outgassing as ice turns to vapor, creating natural thrust. That behavior is chaotic but predictable. Atlas wasn't behaving that way. The adjustments were precise, timed, repeated. They looked less like random forces and more like corrections. In her initial report, Dr. Hammond chose her words carefully. The comet's orbital parameters appeared to be actively maintained rather than passively evolving. Her supervisor escalated the findings immediately. By January 13th, the data reached NASA's Planetary Defense Office. By January 15th, 3 independent teams had confirmed the same conclusion. Atlas's trajectory changes could not be explained by gravity, radiation pressure, or standard comet physics. And that realization set off the alarms that would lead directly to the White House briefing just 2 days later. At that moment, officials weren't asking whether Atlas was dangerous. They were asking something far more troubling. What else had we missed while the world wasn't looking? And that question only became more urgent once analysts began comparing the trajectory data to something else that had been sitting in storage just as long. And that's where this story truly begins to change. The moment analysts overlaid Atlas's trajectory data with archived imagery, the conversation shifted from academic curiosity to quiet alarm. The images in question had been taken years earlier, captured by space-based telescopes, and stored away, waiting for formal publication that never came. When those visuals were re-examined alongside the orbital anomalies Dr. Hammond had identified, patterns began to emerge that no one was prepared to explain away. The comet's surface didn't look like a loose pile of ice and dust. Instead of irregular contours and chaotic fractures typical of cometary nuclei, the images showed repeated geometric features, straight edges, rectangular shadows, symmetry where none should exist. On their own, those details could have been dismissed as imaging artifacts or coincidence. Combined with the precise trajectory adjustments, they told a different story, one that forced analysts to consider possibilities far outside standard models. By January 16th, this combined analysis was formally presented to NASA leadership. Within hours, the findings were flagged for escalation. The question was no longer whether Atlas behaved strangely, but whether its behavior suggested intent. That single shift in framing was enough to trigger the emergency briefing request sent to the White House the following morning. What made the situation even more uncomfortable was the context in which Atlas arrived. In early 2020, planetary defense systems were technically operational, but practically weakened. Staffing shortages, disrupted communications, and delayed decision-making were widespread across agencies. International coordination, which is essential for tracking and responding to near-Earth objects, was severely reduced. If an object had required urgent attention or rapid response, the systems designed to handle that scenario were stretched thin. That reality formed the third pillar of the classified briefing. Atlas didn't just behave oddly. It arrived at a moment when humanity was least capable of responding effectively. Whether that timing was coincidence or calculation remains unknown, but to security analysts, the distinction matters less than the implication. Vulnerability had been exposed. According to a partial briefing summary I reviewed, officials were shown a timeline illustrating how quickly Atlas moved from detection to fragmentation and how little detailed analysis occurred before it was gone. The conclusion was blunt. If Atlas had been something other than natural, there would have been no opportunity to intercept it, study it up close, or even recognize what it was before it vanished. That assessment unsettled more than just NASA. The Department of Defense and intelligence agencies were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. There were no protocols in place for identifying or responding to objects that blurred the line between natural phenomena and potential technology. Space surveillance systems are designed to track threats, not to interpret intent. Dr. Richard Saunders, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, who later reviewed the findings, summed it up succinctly in a private conversation. The danger wasn't that Atlas might have been artificial. The danger was that if it was, we had no way to notice in time, no framework, no decision tree, no coordinated response. This realization sparked a broader internal review. Analysts began asking hypothetical questions that had never been formalized. What would deliberate reconnaissance from interstellar space look like? How subtle could it be and still succeed? How small could an object be while remaining effective? Atlas fit uncomfortably well into several of those scenarios, not because it matched them perfectly, but because it wasn't inconsistent with them. By January 18th, congressional leaders were being briefed. The language was careful, cautious, and deliberately non-alarmist. But the message was clear. There were gaps in planetary defense that went beyond asteroid impacts. There were blind spots in how anomalies were identified, prioritized, and escalated. And those blind spots had been exposed at the worst possible time. Publicly, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. A short statement acknowledged renewed interest in historical comet data. No urgency, no headlines. But behind closed doors, funding discussions began almost immediately. So did conversations about restructuring how interstellar objects would be handled in the future. Because whether Atlas was natural or not, one fact was undeniable. It had slipped through a system that assumed nature was predictable and harmless unless proven otherwise. And now, 5 years too late, officials were confronting the cost of that assumption. What followed next would turn that quiet concern into a full-scale policy shift, one that is still unfolding and that most people don't realize began with a comet the world thought it had already forgotten. That realization, that Atlas had slipped through unnoticed at a moment of maximum vulnerability, became the driving force behind a rapid shift in Washington's internal posture. The question officials were now asking wasn't speculative or philosophical, it was practical. If something anomalous entered our solar system once and went largely unexamined, how likely was it that it could happen again? On January 19th, Dr. Richard Saunders was brought into a closed briefing as an external consultant on space security. While bound by classification restrictions, he later described the atmosphere in the room as restrained but tense. No one was panicking. That was almost more unsettling. The discussion wasn't framed around worst-case scenarios. It was framed around failure points, missed indicators, assumptions that no longer held. One of the central issues was identification. Planetary defense systems are optimized to answer one question: will this object hit Earth? Atlas never posed an impact threat, so it never triggered heightened scrutiny. Its behavior, however, raised a different question that no system was designed to answer. What if the object's purpose wasn't collision at all? That distinction mattered. If Atlas had been a reconnaissance platform or a passive observer, it would have succeeded precisely because it didn't look dangerous. Its subtle trajectory adjustments stayed below thresholds designed to flag hazards. Its fragmentation conveniently erased the chance for direct study. From a purely analytical standpoint, it was an efficient way to gather data without revealing intent. That framing deeply unsettled defense analysts, not because it proved anything, but because it exposed a conceptual gap. There was no category for objects that were neither benign nor overtly threatening. Atlas occupied that gray zone, and the systems meant to protect the planet simply weren't built to operate there. By January 20th, members of the House Subcommittee on Space and Aeronautics were receiving classified briefings. Congressman Jake Morrison emerged days later with a carefully worded public statement about gaps in planetary defense and the need for immediate funding. The phrasing stood out. He emphasized preparedness for objects entering the solar system, whether natural or otherwise. In Washington, language like that is never accidental. Behind closed doors, the discussion was more direct. Lawmakers were told that Atlas exhibited multiple characteristics inconsistent with known comet behavior. None of those characteristics, taken alone, proved anything. Together, they justified concern. More importantly, they justified action. Representative Sarah Chen, the ranking member of the same subcommittee, was reportedly even more blunt in private conversations with reporters. NASA's briefing, she said, described an object that behaved in ways existing models could not explain. The implication, left unstated but clearly understood, was that the artificial hypothesis could not be dismissed. Still, caution remained paramount. No official was willing to declare Atlas anything other than anomalous. That restraint wasn't about secrecy for its own sake. It was about uncertainty. Declaring intent without evidence would create panic without benefit. But ignoring the anomalies would guarantee that the same mistake could be repeated. On January 23rd, NASA quietly announced the formation of a new interstellar object characterization task force. The press release was brief and received little attention. Its stated mission was to improve analysis of objects entering the solar system from beyond. The unstated mission, confirmed by multiple sources, was to ensure that Atlas would never happen again. The leadership choice was telling. Dr. Ellen Rodriguez, appointed to head the task force, brought experience from both planetary science and intelligence analysis. That combination reflected the shift underway. Interstellar objects were no longer viewed solely as scientific opportunities. They were potential intelligence problems. At the same time, internal planning documents began circulating across agencies. Budgets were revised. Timelines were compressed. Projects that once moved at the pace of academic research were suddenly treated as operational priorities. This wasn't a response to public pressure. There was none. It was a response to institutional realization. The conclusion was unavoidable. If Atlas had been deliberate, humanity failed a test it didn't know it was taking. If it had been natural, then the failure was still real, because it revealed how easily critical data could be overlooked during moments of crisis. Either way, the implications were profound. And as policymakers began to accept that reality, preparations shifted from analysis to action. What they planned next would fundamentally change how Earth watches the space beyond its orbit. As planning moved from theory to implementation, the scale of the response became clearer to those inside the system. This was no longer about reviewing old data or refining academic models. It was about building capacity where none had existed. The realization that an anomalous object could enter, behave unpredictably, and disappear without triggering meaningful action had fundamentally altered how risk was being defined. Internal assessments made one thing plain. The problem wasn't a lack of telescopes or sensors. It was interpretation. Data had existed in abundance during Atlas's approach. What was missing was a framework that treated unusual behavior as potentially significant even when no immediate danger was present. The assumption that non-threatening meant non-important had quietly shaped decades of policy. That assumption was now being dismantled. By late January, budget proposals circulating through defense and science agencies reflected a dramatic shift in priorities. The Planetary Defense Coordination Office requested a funding increase of nearly 300% for the next fiscal year. The justification wasn't asteroid impacts, it was rapid characterization, the ability to identify, analyze, and interpret objects in near real time before they were lost or destroyed by solar proximity. At the same time, Several space-based observation systems that had been considered long-term ambitions were suddenly fast-tracked. Launch schedules were compressed by years. Design requirements were modified to emphasize resolution and responsiveness over cost efficiency. The message from leadership was unmistakable. Speed now mattered more than elegance. International cooperation also took on new urgency. Quiet discussions began with partner nations to establish a shared monitoring network for interstellar objects. Unlike existing collaborations, which focused on collision risk, this initiative emphasized anomaly detection. The goal was simple. No single country should be the sole interpreter of something unusual. Redundancy and shared analysis would reduce the chance of oversight. Yet the most striking development appeared in documents that were never meant for public release. Within defense planning materials, a new category appeared: close approach response options. The language was deliberately technical, but the meaning was clear. Kinetic interdiction, the capability to alter or destroy an object if deemed necessary. This was not an announcement, it was a contingency. And contingencies are only written when decision makers believe a scenario, however unlikely, cannot be ignored. Meanwhile, the scientific community began feeling the effects of this shift without being told its cause. Researchers were contacted about accelerating projects that normally would have taken a decade to mature. High-resolution imaging systems, advanced adaptive optics, data processing pipelines designed to flag subtle deviations automatically. Funding arrived quickly, often from classified sources, with minimal explanation. One researcher at a major university described the change as unsettling, not because the work itself was alarming, but because of the urgency behind it. Deadlines that once spanned careers were suddenly measured in months. Outside official channels, concern deepened. A former intelligence analyst summarized the situation privately with brutal clarity. The fear wasn't invasion, the fear was ignorance. The possibility that something could observe, measure, and depart without us even realizing it had done so. That concern was echoed in a conversation I had with a former student now working inside the intelligence community. We hadn't spoken in years. The call was brief and cautious. He couldn't share details, but he confirmed what many inside government were thinking. The key to understanding Atlas wasn't its composition or origin, it was timing. If someone wanted to test Earth's detection systems without revealing intent, the optimal moment would be during global disruption, when coordination was weakest, when attention was divided, when response capacity was degraded. Atlas arrived during exactly such a moment. That doesn't prove intent, but it forces uncomfortable questions about assumptions, about how easily normalcy can blind systems designed for extraordinary events. As January drew to a close, the internal narrative had fully shifted. Atlas was no longer treated as a mystery to be solved. It was treated as a lesson, a case study in how uncertainty, distraction, and institutional inertia can combine to create vulnerability. And with that lesson came a sobering realization. Whatever Atlas truly was, the next object would not wait for humanity to feel ready. That realization reshaped how officials began thinking about the future. The question was no longer whether Atlas had been natural or artificial. That debate, while important, was secondary. What mattered more was exposure. The understanding that Earth's monitoring systems had gaps wide enough for something unusual to pass through unnoticed was now impossible to dismiss. Inside agencies like NASA and the Department of Defense, internal reviews turned inward. Analysts replayed the 2020 timeline again and again, searching for decision points where a different choice might have led to deeper scrutiny. What they found was not negligence, but fragmentation. Data existed, but it lived in silos. Astronomers tracked brightness and breakup. Orbital analysts modeled motion. Security agencies paid little attention because no threat profile existed to trigger concern. Atlas fell between categories. That gap became the focal point of reform. New internal directives emphasized pattern recognition over single anomalies. A strange trajectory alone was no longer enough to be dismissed. An unusual surface feature by itself might still be natural, but when multiple irregularities aligned, trajectory, morphology, timing, behavior, that combination would now trigger automatic escalation. This shift was subtle but profound. It meant abandoning the long-standing comfort of assuming nature first and only questioning that assumption if danger appeared obvious. Atlas had proven that obvious danger is not the only relevant metric. By early February, classified tabletop exercises were already underway. These weren't publicized drills. They were scenario analyses designed to answer one unsettling question. What would we do if another atlas appeared tomorrow? The results were not reassuring. Even with improved awareness, response options remained limited. Intercept missions require years of preparation. Deflection technologies are designed for asteroids on collision courses, not objects with uncertain intent or behavior. Communication strategies assume transparency, yet panic avoidance often demands silence. The exercises revealed a deeper issue. Humanity has no agreed-upon protocol for ambiguity. When something is neither clearly hostile nor clearly benign, decision-making stalls. Atlas exploited that gray zone, whether by design or coincidence. That realization explains why policy discussions began expanding beyond science and defense into diplomacy and governance. If an interstellar object displayed non-random behavior, who decides how to respond? A single nation? A coalition? No one had answers, only urgency. Meanwhile, outside government, the academic community was beginning to sense that something had changed. Papers referencing interstellar objects faced unusual scrutiny. Grant proposals related to anomaly detection received accelerated reviews. Conferences that once treated the topic as speculative began framing it as operational. Yet publicly, almost nothing had changed. The press release language remained cautious. The word artificial was never used. The narrative stayed anchored to preparedness for natural hazards. But behind that narrative was an unspoken consensus. Atlas was a warning shot, not because it threatened Earth, but because it revealed how unready we were to interpret the unexpected. What troubled many officials most was finality. Atlas was gone, vaporized by the sun, fragmented beyond recovery. There would be no second look, no probe, no sample return. Whatever answers it carried were lost. That absence created urgency bordering on regret. Because if Atlas had been deliberate, if it had observed us, then it had already succeeded. It arrived unnoticed, behaved strangely without consequence, and departed before we understood what we were seeing. That possibility reframed every future detection. The next object would not be treated casually. It would not be allowed to fade into archives. It would be examined exhaustively, perhaps aggressively, because the cost of another missed opportunity was now understood. And that brings us to the present moment, to the reason this story matters now, not as history, but as context. Because as officials acknowledged privately in recent briefings, Atlas may not have been unique. It may have been early. And if that's true, then what we are building today is not a response to the past, but preparation for something that has not yet arrived. That perspective has now settled quietly into the background of policy making. Atlas is no longer treated as an isolated anomaly, but as a benchmark, a reference point against which all future detections will be measured. Every new object entering the solar system is now viewed through a different lens, not with fear, but with caution informed by experience.